Little Britches, funny. Father and I were ranchers. Ralph Moody is the author of this. We're on chapter 17. I meet the sheriff. All during the time we were building the cellar and the corral, Grace and I had to do our schoolwork after supper. Father worked with us too, but I couldn't make out what he was doing. He had some big sheets of wrapping paper that came with the groceries, and his steel square and dividers, and while we were studying, he'd be drawing pictures. Once in a while, he'd ask Mother to figure out an arithmetic problem for him, and then he'd change his drawings all around. The morning after we finished building the pole corral, he and I drove Fanny to Inglewood. It was at the end of the Denver streetcar line and had lots more stores than Fort Logan. First, we went to the blacksmith shop and got a couple of lengths of angle iron, small pulley wheels, and pieces of round iron rod. Then, at the hardware store, we bought sheets of galvanized iron, 3 or 4 kinds of screen wire, some coarse and some fine, and lots of bolts, screws, and other things. There was so much that I knew it would cost a lot of money, and I asked Father if we'd have any left. He took out his long leather pouch and showed me that there was quite a little silver and some bills in it. Then he said that part of it was mine. And asked me if there was something I wanted to buy. I told him I wished I had a steel trap, so we went over to the corner where the guns and traps were, and he helped me pick out one, the right size for prairie dogs and skunks. I was wondering what we were going to do with all the hardware and the iron, and after we started for home, Father told me we were going to build a winnower. 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 He said it could cost too much to have a big machine come to thresh our peas and beans, but we'd have plenty of time during the winter to do it with our hand flails and a winnower. Now you know. Now you have some idea what a winnower is. After we got home, he spread a roll of brown paper out on the bunkhouse floor, got his drawings, and began cutting patterns the way Mother did for making clothes. Father didn't need me to help him, so I went out to set my new trap. Before I left, he told me I'd have to set it quite away from the buildings, so King or one of the other cats wouldn't get it. And then I'd have to stay away from it if I expected to catch anything. I took it clear over beyond the railroad tracks and set it near a prairie dog village. I knew they liked peas, so I sprinkled dried grass over it till it was almost hidden, then put a little handful of peas right above the trigger plate. After it was all set, I went back to the bunkhouse and watched Father cut patterns for a while. But I kept asking him if he didn't think it was about time I brought in the cows. I was wondering if I'd caught a prairie dog yet, and I could go around that way when I went for the cows without having it seem too obvious that I was anxious about my trap. Father didn't let me go for them till sunset. As soon as I got out behind the barn where nobody could see me, I ran to beat the band. From the railroad track, I could see that there was something in my trap, but it didn't look like a prairie dog. It looked bigger and brighter. When I got close enough, I found that it was a big cock pheasant. His head was inside the jaws of the trap, and there were a few flat feathers blowing around from his flapping when he broke his neck. The first thing that popped into my head was what Fred Otland had said about spending the rest of your life in the hoosegow if I killed a pheasant. I was so scared I got all shaky. First, I thought the best thing to do would be to get him out of there and hide him at the bottom of a ditch gulch, a deep gulch, that is. I looked all around to see if anybody was in sight. Then I stepped up on the trap spring and took him out. The jaws had pulled a lot of feathers out of his neck and had almost bitten his head clear off. So if I hit him in a gulch and somebody found him, they'd know just what had happened. Then I figured that if I didn't hide him, but just threw him down in the gulch, the coyotes would come and eat him. It wasn't very dark yet, and I was afraid somebody might see me if I just lugged him over across the prairie. So I took off my coat and wrapped him up in it. After gathering up all the loose feathers, I started for the gulch. But the farther I went, the more I worried for fear the coyotes might not eat him. It seemed as if it would be like trying to eat a pillow. I was sure they wouldn't do it because they'd get their mouths all full of feathers. Then I thought, if I picked him, they'd be sure to eat him, and I could let the wind blow the feathers away so nobody could ever tell. No one could ever tell I'd had anything to do with it. By that time, I'd reached the edge of the gulch and slid down over the bank to start picking. It was getting pretty dark, but when I unwrapped him, I could see what a mess I was in. The pheasant hadn't bled a bit with the trap jaws around his neck, but after I'd wrapped him up, blood had run out of his mouth till the inside of my coat was all red and sticky. I didn't know what to do. Just as if I were deciding it for me, a coyote howled. Just as he were deciding it for me, a coyote howled from somewhere farther down the gulch. I bundled the pheasant up quick and went after the cows. I knew I'd have a pheasant. I knew I'd have to have fathers. Oh, I'm sorry. Avery. Okay, I'll be right back. I knew I'd have to have Father's help to ever get out of the mess I was in. Everybody was into supper by the time I got the cows home, so I hid the pheasant, slammed the bunkhouse door as if I'd been in to hang up my coat, and went into the house. The minute I stuck my head inside the kitchen door, Mother said, "What in the world have you been up to now? You look as though a ghost has been chasing you." I said I hadn't been up to anything, but the cows had been way over by the big gulch, and it was all full of coyotes, and maybe that had scared me just a little. Then she told Father that I was too young to be way off out there after dark, and that I'd have to start after the cows earlier. He just said, and bowed his head to say grace as soon as I was in my chair. He might just as well have said to me, "You and I will talk more about this later." We went out to milk right after supper. I don't think I had more than a dozen squirts of milk in the bottom of my bucket, just enough so it didn't ring anymore. When Father said, "What did you do? Get your own foot in your trap?" I said, "No, sir." And then I went ahead and told him about catching the pheasant, but I didn't tell him about wanting to hide it. I asked him if he thought they'd put me in a hoosgow, as Fred said, if the sheriff found out about it. Father didn't say a word for a minute or two. And then he said, "It isn't a case of if the sheriff finds out about it. It's a case of you're breaking the law without intending to. If you tried to cover it up, you'd be running away from the law. Our prisons are full of men whose real crime was running away because they didn't have courage enough to face punishment for a small offense. Tomorrow you must go to see the sheriff. I'll explain to Mother about your coat." I didn't have a very good night. I couldn't keep my mind on my business after supper, and Mother nearly spanked me because I got all mixed up and couldn't say the table of 12s. She gave me a glass of warm milk before I went to bed, but it didn't make me sleep any better. Whenever I wasn't awake, I was dreaming. Mother used to recite the Ballad of Reading Goal. And that night I kept dreaming I was the man in the ballad. Every time I'd wake up in the pitch dark, I'd put my hand over and feel for Philip to make sure it wasn't really so. After breakfast, I begged Father to go to Fort Logan with me to see the sheriff, but he said no. You haven't learned to ask for advice before you go into scrapes, and it isn't fair to expect help in getting yourself out every time. I told him I'd have to go with myself because I didn't know who the sheriff was. And I'd never be able to find him alone. Oh, I'm sorry. Boy, that sounded foolish. I told him he'd have to go with me because I didn't know who the sheriff was, and I would never be able to find him alone. He just boosted me up on Fanny's back and handed me the bag with the pheasant in it. Then he said, "You found Two Dogs Lodge all right, without any help, didn't you? If you ask at the post office, I think they'll be able to tell you where you can find the sheriff." I'd always cantered Fanny all the way to Fort Logan, and right up to the hitching rail. But that morning, I made her walk. For a while, I thought about running away, but the only place I knew I could go was up to Two Dogs. If he'd lived alone, I guess I might have gone, but I remembered what a hurry Mr. Thompson had been in to bring me back right home, so I decided I'd better not try. All the time I was thinking about running away, I kept getting a squirmy feeling in my stomach because of what Father had told me when we were milking. After I made up my mind that I was going to be brave and face the music, it stopped a little, but it came right back again when I went into the post office. The lady behind the window told me I'd find the sheriff over at the Last Chance Saloon, just outside the gates of the fort. At first I thought that would give me a good enough reason to go home without seeing him, because I knew what Mother thought of saloons, and of course she wouldn't want me to go into one. So I climbed back on Fanny and started down the street toward the Morrison Wagon Road. I knew Mother would say I had done the right thing, but I tried not to even think about what Father might say. I couldn't help it, though, and I wasn't a bit sure he wouldn't say it was running away from the law and tearing boards off my character house. He had just turned into the Morrison Wagon. We had just turned into the Morrison Wagon Road when I got a big lump in my throat. Then I pulled Fanny around and galloped her back to the hitching rail in front of the Last Chance Saloon. My heart was thumping like 60 when I went in, though, and a little swooning when I went in through a little swinging door. I was scared, but I was a little bit proud, too, that I had business big enough that I could go right into a saloon. I stopped just inside the doors. It was kind of dark in there, and there were about a dozen soldiers and other men leaning against the bar and talking loud. The man behind it yelled, "What you doing in here, bub? Who you want to see?" He leaned across the bar, and I went over and told him I wanted to see the sheriff. He just jerked his thumb toward the back of this room and said, "The big fella." The sheriff was talking to another man when I got back there, so I stood behind him and waited for him to get finished. He was the biggest man I'd ever seen. My head didn't come up as high as the top of his cartridge belt, and the longer I waited, the bigger the lump in my throat got. At last, the man behind the bar came back and told the sheriff I was there. So he leaned over and said, "What can I do you for, son?" I had to swallow hard before I could make a sound. Then I said, I broke the law, and Father made me come down and tell you." So he said, Well, we'll have to look into this." While he was still saying it, he set me up on the bar in front of him and asked me what I'd done. All the men along the bar came and made a big crowd around us. I showed him the pheasant and told him that I didn't kill it on purpose, but it got into my trap when I tried to catch a prairie dog. He took the pheasant and laid it on the bar beside me. Then he rumpled up all its feathers and felt it all over with his hands. After he'd finished, he said to the men, "By God, that's the way he got it all right. I'd have sworn his old man shot it and sent the kid to get himself out of a pickle." I didn't like that, and I guess I must have yelled, "Father wouldn't try to get himself out of a pickle." Everybody laughed and hollered, and the sheriff said, "Kind of like your old man, don't you?" That makes you think he wouldn't do it to get out of a scrape. I told him then what Father had said about our prisons being full of men who ran away from the law. But by that time, nobody laughed. The sheriff put the pheasant back in the bag and handed it to me. He said the law was that you couldn't shoot a pheasant, but he didn't remember anything in it against catching one in a steel trap. So I'd better take it home for Mother to roast. Then he asked me if I'd like a drink. I told him I'd liked brandy with sugar and water in it, but Mother would only give it to me when I got blue from the cold. All the men laughed more, and one soldier yelled, "Set that kid up a shot of brandy, Tom." But the sheriff shook his head and told the barman to make it birch beer. At first, I didn't know if Mother would want me to drink it, but the sheriff said it was all right. I was two, as in I'm okay too. I cantered Fanny home as fast as she could go, and Father didn't scold me for bringing her in hot. Everybody came out to the barn when I got there, and I told them what the sheriff said, and I didn't tell them about the saloon and the birch beer. But I didn't tell them about the saloon and the birch beer. Grace and Philip seemed to think I was a little more important now that I had talked to a real sheriff. Mother took the bag with the pheasant in it and said the sheriff must be a fine man. I guess Father thought so too, because he said he must look him up the next time he went to Fort Logan. I pretty nearly told Father where to find him, but I caught myself just in time. That night, when we were milking, he told me it had been a day I should remember. He said it would be a good one for me, as I grew older, to know that a man always made his troubles less by going to meet them instead of waiting for them to catch up with him or trying to run away from them. The next morning, Fred Altland came to Father after we finished breakfast. I guess Mother knew he was coming because she had already told Grace and me we could spend the day visiting Willie and Ada, that is, Aldebot. I tried to get Father to tell me where he was going, but all he would say was, "Oh, we're going way over by Littleton to see a fellow about a dog." When Father said that, it always meant he was going to tell you where he was going. It always meant he wasn't going to tell you where he was going. So I didn't ask anymore. Grace and I had a fine time at Aldebot's. Their house was a soddy on the front and was dug right back into a bank like a cave. They had a big farm full of hay and a donkey and half a dozen horses we could ride. The girls made us play house with them some of the time, but we made them try to ride the donkey, and they took some of the craziest spills I ever saw. I think we had the most fun, though, jumping through the high hay mow down into a pile of straw on the barn floor. It must have been 30 feet. Father and Fred got home just a little after we did. They were leading a beauty of a bay horse. He wasn't quite as big as Fred's new one, but he had a lot more ginger. I guess we youngsters and Mother frightened him when we all ran out to look. But anyway, he started bucking and pitching like old Harry just as they were coming into the backyard. If he hadn't had half-inch rope around his neck, as well as having a halter on, I think he would have broken away. They had quite a time putting him into the corral without getting kicked, and as soon as they let him loose, he went racing around and around the fence, kicking his heels higher than the top rail. Mother was all flustered about how dangerous the new horse was, and made us children stay in the house till supper time. While he was eating, Father began telling what fine horses there were at the auction, but Mother said, "Didn't they have any nice gentle ones, Charlie?" I'm afraid one of these bad ones is going to get hurt, or going to hurt us, or going to hurt you. That's what she said to Charlie. Going to hurt you. Father grinned and said, he isn't a bad one, Mamie. He's a good one. He's the best I ever saw. But he's just a 3-year-old right in off the range, and he's never had a man's hand on him until today. It looked for a minute as if Mother was going to cry. I don't care if he's 3 or 30. He's bad. Bad all the way through. Or he wouldn't have thrashed around and fought the way he did. I don't see why you don't buy a nice, gentle horse. You can't tell what will happen to Ralph with that kind of horse around the place. Father got up and went around behind Mother's chair. He put both hands on her cheeks and patted them. Then he said, Son, I want you to make me a promise that you won't go near the new horse or into the corral while he's in there until I say you may. My mouth was full, but as soon as I could swallow, I said, I promise, Father. I could have brought a gentle horse, Mamie. There were some, not much bigger than Nig, that brought $75. That's what this one cost, and that's all we planned we could spend. Well broken, young horses, as good as he is, were bringing $125 or more. I picked him out before they ever put a rope on him, and there's nothing vicious about him. He's simply crazed with fear right now. I'll be very careful in breaking him. Mother reached up and patted his hand against her face. You'll be awful careful, won't you, Charlie? Was all she said. Father was real good about making people believe what he said. The end of chapter 17.